All right, here we are, late as always, on the Scroll of Thoth podcast. And once again, Friday Central L is MIA. What's going on, man?
Not a lot. Just enjoying the night. How you been?
Working, getting by, hustle here, hustle there. You know what it's
Right?
like.
Such is life.
So
Always, always, always.
I'm a little bit sad that we're doing this without Jason, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. That because one thing that I get from a lot of people who have read the Gutter Bible, who have seen the protocols of the Order of Emergent Magi and stuff, that whole magic without drugs isn't. Seems to stick in their craw.
Sure.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I honestly, that probably causes a lot of cognitive dissonance for a lot of individuals. Partially because, let's be real, it's not the only path. I suppose before I give you like a strong answer on that and why I think that it causes such a reaction for other people, my first reaction to it was it sounded a little tongue in cheek. You know what I mean? Just knowing the both of you guys, it sounded serious, but not that serious. So if it's not tongue in cheek, maybe you can kind of illuminate me on what you feel that you meant with that.
Okay, it's not tongue in cheek.
Okay,
and this is a pretty long explanation. So, give me a minute, and let me tell you about it. So, it is my belief that, let's start with Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is an archaeological site in Turkey. It's this massive temple complex, carved stones, and these huge monoliths that has several layers deep where they've built and rebuilt this temple. Now, this thing is 8,000 years older than Stonehenge. So, number one, it was built by hunter-gatherers. And why that's important is because it totally blows away the entire, theory of the progress of civilization, where first you get the agriculture, then you get the civilization, and then you get, the temple builders. These were hunter-gatherers. These were people without settlements that came together to build these things. And it's indicative of what hunter-gatherers were doing. And maybe it's not direct evidence of what Homo sapiens have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, but at least for a huge period of time, because this thing is, built over thousands of years. Like I said, they rebuilt it to help it align with certain astronomical phenomena. Now, the thing that they found at Göbekli Tepe, one of the main things besides the monument themselves, were vats. And in these vats, they found residue of barley, as in barley that was used for some kind of preparation. And we all know barley, you do two things with it. Three, you can make bread, you can make barley wine, and also barley just happens to be the grain that is most susceptible to ergot, which is a psychedelic fungus. Is what LSD is derived from. So all these ancient people use drugs as a major part of their practice, of their spirituality. And I look at this and I say, okay, so for tens of thousands of years, when people believed in magic wholeheartedly, there was no question. And so the best minds of that era, of all that time, which is way longer than civilization has been even been around, was about taking drugs and having spiritual experience. Now, maybe, just maybe, they were fucking onto something, and it's encoded in our DNA.
No, okay. I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, the mystical experience is perhaps derived from, getting fucked up, for lack of a better way of putting it. But so to get back to the question you asked me, why do I think people have a reaction to it when it clearly has a place in history, in prehistory? Very likely because of the lack of a cultural context within our society, within American society. I mean, we've done nothing but demonize it, basically for the past, couple hundred years, or longer, at least as long as, we've been putting laws on the books. So I think that's largely the reason that people have the reaction that they do. Secondly, because when you say magic without drugs isn't, it almost sort of sounds like you're saying you have to get fucked up in order to do magic. And I would argue, and they would probably argue as well, that that's not the only path. Dropping acid isn't the only path to experiencing something mystical. So there's probably a couple of things happening in their mind when they react the way they do.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I agree. And we've talked about this before on the show, where you don't have to fucking drop acid. You don't have to take illegal drugs. You can, if you don't take drugs on a regular basis, you could have a fucking cigarette and a shot of booze and reach an altered state. Sure. And add to that rhythmic experiences like dancing and other things to develop what chaos magicians call gnosis. And I think why it's so important to EMK is that drugs have also usually, not always, but usually been about group experience. And to me, that's a huge part of EMK, that it is about groups of people coming together and having these experiences. And that kind of group consciousness is certainly better developed with drugs. I mean, I've seen it. I've seen it time and again.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree on that level. I mean, when your mind is well lubricated, when all of your minds are well lubricated, they do tend to play well together, at least in a magical sense.
Yeah.
So. And in that respect, I think you're definitely correct. It is about a group experience, but then again, within that group, you have a context for what you're doing. I mean, you're not necessarily just getting fucked up.
I agree, and that's one thing. And of course, certain drugs are better than others. I would never recommend that someone fucking take heroin. I mean, heroin is just a nasty fucking drug. It shuts you off. It doesn't lift you up. And I would definitely say psychedelics are the best choice. And probably some of the more intense psychedelic too, like mushrooms, like LSD, where your brain starts making connections that it did not make before. So
right. I mean, that being said, personally, I don't necessarily advocate that anyone takes these substances. I mean, I shouldn't say advocate. I should say I don't promote anyone taking these substances. However, if a person already finds himself along that particular path, I certainly hope that they are educating themselves and, understanding what it is they're taking, it maybe having some sort of an intent behind what it is they're taking. And you're right. I mean, there's definitely certain chemical paths that are far more destructive than others. But that being said, like even psychedelics can be taken to an extreme. I mean,
yeah.
So, I mean, and that's the inherent danger and the inherent risk that just kind of comes along with that particular path, especially when we exist in a culture that doesn't have a context for these things and doesn't treat them as sacred. There is a tendency to essentially dive into these things, grab something that or have a mystical experience that seems profound and meaningful, but coming back to this side of reality, and because you lack a mythology or like I said, a context for the experience, you don't have a lot to latch onto. You don't have a lot of a way of making sense of that particular experience. And so I think that's where the danger comes in, is that people dive back into that, trying to grasp at straws, for meaning. And that, I think, gets people caught up in the deep end and drowning, if you will, in these psychedelic experiences and going a little crazy. So I think that, that's where maybe EMK can potentially build a smaller culture within itself and give meaning to these experiences as a group, and maybe treat them as a sacred experience.
Absolutely. I would go a little bit further and say, if you haven't tried these things, that you should try them once. It's not going to kill you. I mean, well, research keeps coming out that's saying that these drugs, when taken with supervision and in moderation, are incredibly safe.
Sure.
So,
but as it is right now, with these things still being illegal, I mean,
and of course, take them someplace where it's legal.
I mean, it's sort of a, buyer beware, take at your own risk sort of situation, unfortunately, at this point in time. So.
Yeah, with the fact that it is a black market and there is no standardization, that sucks. And that's just a byproduct of prohibition more than anything else. But
sure,
you definitely should have someone who's experienced to guide you through the process and to make it that spiritual experience. Because, yeah, it's so easy to just get fucked up and sit on the couch and watch SpongeBob. I mean, I don't think you're getting too much out of that. But I would also say this. That there's a lot of critics out there who will say, well, you guys are just sitting around taking drugs and calling it magic. Well,
yeah.
Fuck you. Because even if that's it, even if, you're going to drop some LSD and sit around and talk about magic, there is value in that. Because like I said, it does make your brain make connections that you would not make otherwise. And that has a value in itself. So just sitting around and taking psychedelics and talking does have a value.
Well, I think that I would agree, but of course I'm very biased in that, my magic essentially started in these particular psychedelic experiences and having these conversations while under the influence. One thing I've actually been thinking of recently that's kind of a thought I've been entertaining within my own brain space is, people talk about, well, you're just doing drugs to get fucked up. You're just doing drugs recreationally. You're not doing them spiritually. And I'm like, well, hold on a second, because really magic and spirituality are recreation. I mean, you can certainly get a lot of deep meaning and dive into your own psychology and maybe fix some broken bullshit within yourself, but it's still recreation. And if you're not having some amount of fun, you're probably doing it wrong. So that, with spirituality, magic being recreation, you can take drugs for a spiritual or magical meaning. And yeah, it still is recreation. I mean, yeah, you're still getting fucked up with your friends, but perhaps giving it an additional layer of meaning or context, in doing so.
And shouldn't it be enjoyable? I mean, we've got this whole context in the West of hundreds of years of the Catholic Church, where, the spiritual experience is going to some big building and watching some guy fucking moan for a couple hours, and then you go home. And nobody's having fucking fun doing that. I mean, I guess There's a few weirdos out there who get off on it, but, it's not making true human connections. It's not, it's not a good time. And you should enjoy your spirituality. You should enjoy your fucking magic. It should not always be work. Sometimes it's work. I totally admit, and I work on it. I make things, I do the meditation, but are you having fun? Sometimes I got to ask people this. Are you having fun doing this?
Yeah, I think that we do tend to get caught up in kind of that Judeo-Christian mindset that, that which is pleasurable cannot possibly be spiritual. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to be said about that, divine moments of ecstasy. I mean, the dissolution of ego, and basically losing yourself in that blissful moment. I mean, that's not to say, like, that there isn't something to be said for pain gnosis or putting yourself through some sort of exhaustion, right? That is incredibly difficult, delving into your psyche and working with the shadow self isn't always the most pleasant thing in the world. But again, I think it comes back to just having a healthy balance. Because like I stated earlier, if you continually, dissolve into nothingness in a state of pure bliss, I mean, you're probably not going to be very fucking productive in your life, and things are going to start falling apart. So it's got to be a healthy balance with both hard work and play.
Absolutely.
So magic without drugs isn't.
Magic without drugs.
Anything else to add to that?
Isn't.
What else do you have to add to that?
I will admit, we do say things to get people's attention. We do say things to kind of slap them in the face and wake them up and say, hey, pay attention to this. And, if your first engagement with it is anger, I'm fine with that. Sure, go ahead. Talk me off of it. Prove me wrong. And I'm open to listening, and I'm open. And I know there's plenty of people who have stories out there who have things that have happened in their life that have been horrible because of drugs, and they're not really able to go on that path. And I totally understand that. And that's valid, from their own experience, that they don't want to go down that road. And I say, don't. But it's a lot of people, like I said, who just haven't experienced it or have a lot of these hang-ups, listen to Nancy Reagan when they were young. I don't know. But they might want to take a closer look. One of the reasons why I'm glad I've got you on this podcast is the party monster paradigm, which does have a lot to do with drugs, I think. And I was wondering if you might want to explain to our listeners what that is and how you have found it useful.
Well, sure. The party monster paradigm, it was obviously, based on the New York club kids scene, and was really just my unhealthy obsession with what I perceived them to be. And essentially, it was sort of the idea that what we define as shallow and what we define as profound, neither necessarily has more meaning than the other. It's just the definition we assign to it, or the meaning we assign to it. So, that which we believe is superficial, something like fashion, we think of as, more shallow or having less meaning than, deep spiritual pursuits or something like that. So it was kind of a marrying of those two concepts. It was like, could I find the profound within the superficial? Could I find the deep end of the shallow? And so that really, anybody who knows anything about the New York club kids scene, knows that ended very badly, largely because of substance abuse. And so my diving into that was partially me working with my own shadow and me working with my own neurosis, and admittedly getting closer to that line between the spiritual use of chemicals and the crazy use of chemicals.
Let me interrupt you just a sec. What was the substance that you think that really was the problem?
The substance, I mean, the substance for myself, or
for that
the
scene.
substance for that scene. I mean, I'm not quite sure that I can answer that specifically because they were using quite a bit. I mean, they were using, I mean, ketamine.
Okay.
There was cocaine, MDMA. I mean, all of like it was everything. I mean, everything that was available essentially. So, I mean, I suppose you would have to ask somebody who's actually there within that particular scene. I mean, arguably, you could say heroin was the one that killed it, since the individual who perpetrated the murder
I find
was
that not
was a heroin
surprising.
addict. Right. But I mean, like I said, me diving into that was really me diving into the depths of my own neurosis and kind of dancing with my own crazy, seeing how close to that safe, not safe line I could push myself towards. And essentially what I learned is, I mean, there is some value for myself in doing that, but it's never anything I would recommend to anybody else. You know what I mean? That's not a way to have a sacred experience.
Okay.
Because there were definitely many moments in which, you know, I could have potentially not pulled myself back or not pulled myself out of it, you know, and it could have ended much more poorly than it did. So,
yeah, I'm gonna have to, you know, I guess I agree with you because it does align with my philosophy and my personal experience. You know me, and you know I'm the kind of guy where if I'm going to go driving or something, I won't even touch a bowl of weed at that point. You know, morning comes and I'm done, and it's not going to be a continuous thing. I don't do cocaine. I don't do heroin. I don't try to take anything that's too much of an upper or too much of a downer because I don't see much value in that. It's not really expanding my mind. So yeah, I can see that. So what kind of work have you done within the party monster paradigm? Well, first, back up a little. So how did you recreate this as a paradigm?
So essentially, we took the main characters from the paradigm, and we sort of pulled out the characters from who they were. So we basically took the characters Michael Alec and James St. James, and we pulled what we thought was the essence of their characters out of them, and then recreated deities based on our idea or our perception of who they were within the movie and within James St. James' book. So essentially what ended up happening is we ended up with two deities that were essentially the same but polar opposites. So we had one deity that represented heroin, death, superficiality. We had the other one who represented cocaine, life, an actual connection with other individuals. So as we kind of worked with these things, we realized that they were both sides of the same thing. They were basically both these neurotic and crazy creatures that were kind of lost together in this life-death sort of dance of insanity, you know? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we also based other. We ended up with other deities based on other characters. So we had the DJ character who ended up being our priest, and essentially what we found there was that the DJ was a hollow deity that really only contained what you put into it. So it provided the space and it provided the beat on the dance floor. So basically it provided the temple space for you to go get your groove on and have the sacred experience. But essentially it was nothing more than a figurehead. It was nothing more than, you know, a thing putting out sound for you to experience yourself through. So I don't know. There was also the drug dealer deity, which is essentially the provider of gnosis or the provider of wisdom, which is also the provider of insanity. So these things all had a very dualistic nature, and it all kind of danced around insanity and neurosis. So.
And I gotta say, this is one of the things I love about paganism in general. Even when you're creating your own deities, is that it can teach you so much more than some kind of monotheistic, all perfect God. You know, what the fuck are you going to learn from that when you really need to be interacting with things that are fucked up beyond a human level to really kind of understand what's going on in ourselves. So I love that. I remember one ritual that I participated in where you structured it where essentially people invoked these deities and you brought people in to this party and they just experienced it. And it almost ended up becoming like an exhibit piece. But that was interactive, kind of an art. The word just jumped out of my head, kind of an avant-garde art piece that I thought was fantastic.
Well, and where that really came from was my time that I spent in the rave scene. When I kind of found my way to the rave scene, it wasn't specifically because I was into electronic music or anything like that. I was actually deliberately doing a lot of ego magic on myself and reinventing kind of who I was. Essentially, after my hardcore psychedelic use, I realized that on some level, I had my own microcosm figured out, if you will, and yet I didn't necessarily know how to interact with the external world. So mostly because I was very, very introverted, and a part of me wanted to play. And figure out what that experience was out in the real world. So I found my way to the rave scene and I found chemicals and I started costuming a lot. And essentially what me and a friend ended up doing was we would go to raves, but we would essentially hijack these raves. And we would create our own event within the event. And instead of a bunch of kids going to a rave and getting fucked up, we were now a bunch of kids going to a rave getting fucked up, but there was a theme involved. So we did power animals. We did love and lust, which was dress up like your concept of what you think love or lust would be for the night. We did circus theme. We did Zodiac one time. I mean, we did countless different parties where we basically, like I said, hijacked it, themed it, got a bunch of people to dress up, and we really sort of created this community around dressing up. It was these kids who already went to these parties, but we really kind of became our own club scene. And that's kind of where my obsession with the club kids grew out of, was realizing what a community it built. So to go back to the ritual you're talking about, I realized that at that time I was using this rave scene for my own magic, to create my own, identity to some level. So when you were in that space, you were deliberately invoking somebody that I had assigned to you that was a club personality. So, we had the DJ, we had the drug dealer, we had, myself, who was essentially the person that brought you into the club and was that vibrant personality that kind of showed you around and introduced you. We had, the doorman, essentially. And the doorman played its own role in observing the party. And the drug crazed child, Yeah. So in that particular ritual, it was designed to be a ritual within a party. And so when these people came back to this particular ritual, they were in a space at a festival where they were used to walking into a ritual and doing a ritual in a certain way. You know what I mean?
Get in a circle. This is your chant. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's the ABCs. This is what we're going to do. We're going to reach gnosis like this. Here's our intent. Yada, 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 go. And that's all good and well. But I deliberately wanted people to walk back into the space with a party going, not fully understanding what was going on. And then just when they sort of got in the groove of that party and kind of realized, oh, this is a party, this isn't a ritual, that's when I kind of dropped the ritual on them. And the ritual essentially was the main show of the party, and we freed the drug-crazed child, right? Yeah. So the drug-crazed child at the time represented your inner child. And essentially your inner child was that thing that wanted to be creative. It wanted to play, you know, it wanted to dress up. It wanted to experience magic. It wanted to have all these life-affirming experiences. But the rest of the world, as you grow up, kind of beats that out of you. You know what I mean? They're like, no, you can't play. You can't dress up like that. No, don't express yourself this way. Yada, yada, yada. Put that in a bottle. You only get to do that over here by yourself privately. You should be ashamed of that. So on and so forth. So basically what ends up happening to a lot of these individuals is they drink, you know, they have sex addictions, they do drugs. And so the drug-crazed child was somebody who wanted to play and didn't know how to play, and so fucking drugged themselves into a stupor and was now locked in a cage. And I mean, the cage in the ritual was what, made of hula hoops and fucking streamers, I think, which was very deliberate and representative of the fact that the cage is really this bullshit structure that you built in your mind, right? So
I was the guardian of the drug-crazed child, so yeah, I remember that.
That is true. That is true. So, and I mean, the Guardian played a very specific role that night as well, which was, you know, keeping the other revelers away from it and not letting it know, essentially, that it could free itself. So essentially, you kind of represented the rest of the world, like, nah, guarding that inner child. So it was our job through the ritual to convince the drug-crazed child that, you know, she could be free and party with us. So, I mean, that was kind of the core of it, though. But like you said, it was designed to be a party, but it had a ritual kind of hidden within a party. So it was kind of a very deliberate attempt to kind of do what I was doing within the rave scene, but kind of backwards in a different setting. So,
well, thank you for sharing that, because I think it's just an excellent example of how we really do put a lot of thought behind this. And it's not just, you know, let's smoke some weed and talk about stuff.
I mean, that there is, like you said earlier, I mean, there is definitely merit in getting high and bullshitting. But occasionally, I mean, like using these substances in these moments to create something that is, you know, hopefully moving to others, but at least, you know, moving and transformative to yourself, I suppose, definitely happens as well if you allow it to, and if you go at it on some sort of a conscious level.
Yeah, and I guess the last note that I would leave this on for people that, you know, we've said this several times through the podcast, but, you know, be safe out there, you know. If you can, do this where it's legal. There are countries and places where it's legal. There are substances that are still legal. They're not quite as great, you know, stuff like Anamata, Muscaria, a few other psychedelics that you can still get hands on that are legal. And make sure you do a lot of research, and make sure you try to find someone who has experience and can guide you through this. Do you have any other advice for people out there?
Don't do drugs. Just say no. Stay in school.
And there you go. So without our beloved Zentra L, I think we're going to cut this one a little bit short. But we did some good work here. Thanks for hanging out and talking.
Yeah. Mwah.
Mwah.